Hey everyone, this is Eben, and today I'm going to be doing a similar video as the one I did last week. I'm going to be walking you through a speed painting that I put together recently, and this one is a bit longer. It's about an hour and 10 minutes, I think, total in time, but I'm exploring a similar technique here, but today I'm just going to dive in a little more in depth into what I'm sort of thinking, what my strategy is throughout this process. And if you are an artist yourself, feel free to follow along and try to match this technique as I move forward, or feel free to just sit and listen as I talk about what I'm doing here. So I start this piece like I do most of my sort of unstructured daily practice kind of pieces, and this strategy is really important to me for generating ideas and also for establishing some creative freedom within the piece. This is not how I would start something that I was doing for a client or a specific project where I had an end goal in mind. When I start this, I really have no idea, and in fact at this point in the painting I still have no idea what it is that I'm creating. But what I do is I start with just a loose assortment of textures and colors, and I'm basically trying to create a sort of random base layer of texture and saturation that I can that A will form a strong base for other things I put down later, and B will sort of inspire me into creating something interesting and new. I find that when I approach things this way without having some kind of prior mindset, without having some kind of pre-existing idea of what it is that I'm putting down, it opens me up to a lot of creative possibilities that I wouldn't have necessarily considered before. And it also can sometimes allow me to push myself outside of my comfort zone. So at this point, what I'm doing is sort of looking at these shapes, and at this point I'm starting to create some loose perspective lines, because I do want this to end up being a three-dimensional space. So I am sort of thinking about that. I'm thinking about creating shapes that do indicate some kind of depth. At this point I have a bit of a foreground formed. I'm starting to create these sort of tapered column-like structures in the back, and I'm almost starting to, with these sort of sideways semicircular strokes, I am starting to create some three-dimensionality to those shapes, and that three-dimensionality is sort of indicating that I'm looking down at them from above. But as you'll see later, I do end up reversing that perspective decision, and instead I have the viewer looking up at them from below. So the next thing I'm going to do is, as you may have seen with the other 30-minute speed painting video that I posted last week, I will often start by putting down either a solid color or some kind of gradient just to get rid of the white space. I did not do that in this case, not for any particular reason, but just because I wanted to jump right in and sort of fill that space manually. And then the next thing I'm doing here is I'm creating some solid selections and some deliberate shapes that I want to use for this composition. And this is when I start to be a bit more decisive and a bit more clean and clear about what it is that I'm putting down. So you'll notice I've created this rather large foreground shape on the right here, and then I've segmented off a few medium-sized shapes in the middle, and then some very small ones towards the end of what I think at this point I have intended to be some kind of path. And I've also made them sort of irregular. There's nothing really consistent about them. There's a bit of a zigzagging thing, which creates some motion in the piece. And then by dividing it up into these smaller, complex shapes, as the plane recedes into the distance, I am already establishing a sense of three-dimensional space. But I'm also establishing a focal point, which is, I think at this point I've already decided it's going to be around that lower left quadrant. That's where I want all the strokes, all the shapes, all the lines in this image. I want them all to be heading in that direction. So that's something I'm thinking about too as well at this point, and that's something that when you're putting down those initial strokes is really important to consider. You want your, and it's also really fun too, because you can just get really flowy with it. You put down, especially if you're using like a mixer brush or any of these large textured brushes, you can just create this really loose flow. And the important thing is recognizing that and maintaining it through the painting. Because it's really easy for that kind of stuff to be lost as you move forward through the process. So next, I'm probably spending a bit too much time at this phase, sort of using these smaller strokes to shape out these objects. But basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take that two-dimensional shape and create some roundness to it, some curvature to the plane with these curved strokes. And then the next thing I'm doing here is I've actually reversed that selection I had before, and this is a strategy you saw me use in the other video, where I'll make a selection and then just hit, I think it's Control-Alt-I or Control-Shift-I, I can never remember, and that'll invert the selection, and then you can, in this case, paint in the negative space that I created before, which is really useful. And if you don't want those hard edges around your selection, you can also add a feather to it, anywhere between 0 to 10, 15 pixels. That will soften that edge up. But I do prefer to keep those edges really clean, because that's going to be something that will help me later on when I want to develop a lot of clarity and contrast around my focal area. What I generally do with that is I will start with a lot of these hard edges, because using the selection tool really helps me be decisive about the shapes that I'm choosing and the edges that I'm creating. And I find that's one of the most useful tools, honestly, in the digital medium. Is that's something that's really hard to do with traditional oil paint or anything, unless you have like tape or something like that, and even then that's pretty tedious. On Photoshop, you can just make these selections, paint within them, and then what I do is later on I will go in and deliberately lose some of those edges to create a nice dynamic between the hard edges and the soft edges. And you can use that to your advantage to draw more attention to your focal area. So at this point, I am starting to think about what I want to have as my focal point content. And again, I don't really know specifically what it is I'm trying to create. I'm still working in abstraction here, essentially. I've set up a certain mood. So you saw there, I was dialing in a lot more of that intense blue, and that was sort of just a choice I made based on two conditions, really. One being that I know atmosphere tends to take on this bluish hue, especially when it's in a shadowed area like this. And two, it just seemed like it was needed to sort of balance out the color scheme. A lot of what I was putting down were sort of muted reds and browns and greens, and I just felt that I just sort of felt that it was needed, and I needed some strong saturated color there. And that will come in really handy later on when I start developing the direct lighting in this scene, which I end up using a very warm direct lighting source, something like you would find in a sunlight forest, and that's sort of the tone that this ends up taking. At this point, I could have made a completely different choice. I could have, really reinforced those sort of warmer, dull shadow tones, and I could have chosen a cool light source and had that be the predominant mood of the piece, and it would have developed quite differently. It would have been a bit more sinister, a bit more mysterious, perhaps. And these are things to be considering. What down to the very the temperature of your lighting and your shadows. How is that going to affect the mood of the piece? How is it going to reinforce what you've already established? And especially if you are creating a piece with some intention behind it, something for a personal project or for a commission or anything like that, it's definitely something to consider. All of these little subtle color and shape choices are going to either reinforce or detract from the mood you're trying to set. So here I'm using some of the brushes from the Evident concept art brush pack, which is a really great pack. You can download that on the new Evident platform now. It's got all kinds of fun little, very specific, really useful brushes for specific applications like this. This is a foliage brush. But there are also a lot of little, there's like fur and different type of lighting brushes, and there's a bird brush, which is always really fun. So using brushes like that sparingly can be really useful, especially at this phase when I'm just trying to create a lot of loose texture, and I'm also using it in the background, so it's more of a suggestion than anything. I'm not sort of articulating anything too specifically. I am just trying to create a general impression that there is light filtering down through a thick canopy. And I think using that brush with a warmer yellow and yellow-green has been effective in this case for creating that impression. And I still do have, a lot of choices to make at this point. For example, what I could have done is just continued with this sort of backlit column setup and not actually have any of that direct lighting hit the foreground or the midground. It could all just be sort of illuminated from that canopy behind, and then everything else around that focal area and around these shapes could be sort of illuminated by this ambient blue glow. In fact, I think what I was considering at this point was having some kind of either bioluminescent quality, or some kind of, maybe artifact or shrine, or like a pool down there that could be casting this blue glow from beneath, rather than having being directly illuminated from above, as would be kind of the natural tendency of a scene like this. But I do always love experimenting with direct light, especially direct sunlight. It's always very satisfying when you get it right, and that's just something I'm really attracted to. So I did end up pursuing that route, but I did keep some of this blue underglow element in the end, and it's sort of a secondary feature, but it is present, and it does help to create that dynamic between the warm direct light and then sort of this cool blue ambient light. Although in retrospect, it does seem a bit like it could have been a little cooler. I feel like that blue is still a bit warm as blues go, but that's just nitpicking, really. What I'm doing here is I'm starting to key in some detail around the focal area, and that's usually after I've established my full composition, after I have a pretty good idea of how the whole structure is going to work in this piece. That's going to be my next step, because 75 to 80% of your painting's impact is going to rest around this focal point, or if there are multiple focal points, it will rely on those areas. And it does become more complex as you add additional areas of interest, and you have to be careful about the relationships you establish between them. You can't just sort of create a whole bunch of different sort of equivalent detailed areas in a piece. It's always best to just start with one main point of focus, develop that, and then see if you can have some other things sort of play off of that at different scales, at different points in the picture, with varying color schemes, but also following the same general rhythm and motif. So it can be a delicate process when you try to create too much complexity in different areas of your piece. So as I did in this case, I often settle with just one simple point of focus, with the rest of the composition just sort of supporting that area. So what I've done to sort of lead the eye into that is, I've used a lot of these foreground shapes to sort of bring the eye in from the edge of the canvas directly to this area in the bottom left here, but also I've created a literal path, and this is something you'll see me doing all the time, is either an actual physical path, or some kind of naturally occurring element like a river, or even just sort of a cleft in a rock that will that the eye can follow, that the viewer can actually envision themselves walking down towards this important area. And in this case, I've chosen to start that path very wide in the bottom right side of the canvas, and you will even notice where that path meets the edge is very deliberate as well. I'm not having the edge of that path align with a corner. I'm not having the edge of that path line up in the direct center of the canvas. You'll notice that where the left edge of that path meets next to that rock at the bottom edge of the canvas is about at the 60 to 70% mark, and it's not right in the middle. And that's just a useful metric to use when you're mapping out the edges of your canvas. Likewise, you won't really see any of the major elements lining up right in the middle of the piece, or too far to the side. My focal area is pretty much right on the rule of thirds mark down there, and I'm not saying you have to follow that religiously, and it's definitely best to experiment with that as much as possible, but it's always a safe zone, and in this case that's something I've decided to pursue. I'm using another fun strategy here. Since the blue light source, whatever it is, I'm still unsure at this point, is coming from underneath, and there's a pathway leading up the side of this column, and that pathway is also being viewed from underneath. What we're going to see is we're not going to see the top of the pathway there, because it's in a plane facing away from us, but we are going to see a cast shadow from underneath. And so to clarify that, I've actually used a selection tool to select out the sort of the cliff face on the side of the path that's facing towards us, and then I've inverted that selection and sort of used a soft brush to paint in shadow above that area, and that just creates this really nice impression of a sort of underlit rock structure. And so the eye can clearly follow the path from that bottom right area through this nice zigzag into the bottom left quadrant of the piece, and then it will follow that path up the side of this rock column, and eventually just sort of fade out through the top or return to the focal point that I'll establish later at the bottom. Likewise, the viewer can enter the painting through the top of the canvas, where there's a bit of contrast around that the top of that column there, and then follow that path down to the focal point from there. And you can see here I'm relying a lot on this selection tool for this process, and the intent behind that is you can what you'll see perfectly in this last example here is you can use the selection tool to create these shapes, these areas where you know light to be hitting or to be in shadow or whatever it is, and then just use this large textured brush. In this case, I'm really just using one brush for this, and that just, yeah, what I'm doing there, it's really nice to make this sort of dappled light effect, because I made a selection, I did one stroke across with this textured brush, and now I have all of these nice lines of detail that sort of imply that there's shadow being cast from a bunch of small little leaves on there, or a bunch of sticks or twigs or whatever it is. Just a really quick, efficient way to create the suggestion of detail without taking all this time to actually paint it out. And also, as I'm starting to establish this more direct lighting from through the leaves from above, I also want to bear in mind that I don't want to distribute it equally throughout the whole piece. You'll notice that in the center column, I've made it very clear. I've created a lot more high contrast and a bit more clarity and directness with that lighting. But on the ones to the left and right, I've really diluted it and just barely made the suggestion of that light hitting those areas. And it works because it's plausible. We don't question it, because light is never really distributed totally evenly in a forest. But B, it also helps to reinforce the central focal area. So I'm not developing any sort of highly distracting contrast to the left or right of that central point. So another thing I did there was I took a large soft brush, and this is something I kind of alternate between as I move through the piece. I'll sort of use a lot of this texture and these tight selections, and then occasionally I'll notice I'm watching the navigator too, and that's very important as you go through a piece to just keep checking that and make sure it's so important that your piece reads well from a distance for a variety of reasons. I mean, one being that especially nowadays, a lot of people are viewing your work at a very small scale. If you're posting on Instagram or Facebook, unfortunately, they're probably not gonna be blowing it up to their full screen most of the time. But B, it's just fundamentally important because it means that your whole piece is well balanced and that it's working as a whole. It's very easy to get really wrapped up in a little detailed spot, and then you zoom out and you realize this whole thing doesn't make sense from a distance. It's not reading well. And having it read well at that scale also means that it's going to read more quickly. And that's very important as well. Again, also because of the social media presentation aspect of it now, where people are viewing things more quickly, and there's almost this pressure to create a quicker impression. But again, also this is something that's always been a factor in good artwork, is you want to be able to make a quick, clear, decisive impression for your viewer, and then once they are hooked, you can sort of keep them there with your supportive detail and all the other fun, fancy things that you throw in your piece. Here I'm actually using a brush on linear dodge mode, and a lot of times what I will do is create a separate layer on linear dodge mode and use the linear dodge brush on that layer, just because sometimes your lighting choices can be a bit too much, or it might be something you want to dial back later or adjust because it can impact your whole composition or your color and everything. But you'll notice in this case I'm actually working all in one layer still, and I've talked about this a bit before because it's something that I think is fairly rare among digital artists, but it's something that I found works for me more and more these days, and as I progress as an artist working in the digital medium, I find there are a lot of benefits to keeping everything on the same layer. And of course, that's not to say that I don't use multiple layers, or you shouldn't, but it's very easy to get caught up on that, and when you separate your piece out into all these different sections that are sort of uneditable at any time, it can get very stiff and very rigid, and it's sort of, at least in my experience, discourages me from being bold or adventurous or making drastic changes that would risk sort of messing everything up. And I think that's extremely important for being able to progress through a piece, is being able to notice when something isn't working and then to just paint right over it. And I think having everything on the same layer sort of helps me to maintain that mentality of like, oh, if something's not working, I'm just going to paint in a color over it. And I can use the selection tool as well to make those crisp edges that will indicate plane changes that people usually use layers for. That being said, for a piece that is not just sort of a practice or a speed painting like this, I will usually separate out a foreground, a midground, and stuff like that, because it'll save you a lot of time later on when you're doing details or making changes and stuff like that. Or also if you're doing last minute edits and you want to kind of compare different editing stages, that's very useful for that. So back to the painting here. What I've been doing is creating this direct lighting on various parts of this column, as well as the midground here where the main point of focus is. And you'll notice I'm using my brightest highlights around that area, and I don't use that same value anywhere else in the piece, really. And I'm also, even though it's possible for light to be hitting the face of this rock structure evenly, I've chosen not to apply it in that way. And that's just another design choice that I've made that you can make at any time, is you can deliberately place where light is or is not hitting an object to guide the eye to certain areas. And I'm also, with this selection here, I'm creating some atmosphere where the light is sort of hitting the base fog layer there. And instead of it being illuminated in blue, as it is in the shadow, it's sort of taking on a nice orange, red, orange, yellow kind of hue. And I'm also thinking about the fact that if there's a lot of bright direct light hitting the bottom of that path there, it's also going to be reflecting up and hitting the edge of that cliff as well, that cliff face that's facing us. So that's a little while ago I put in some more reddish light, which sort of got a little washed out there, but typically when light is reflected onto another surface, it does take on a bit more of a reddish hue. And there's another thing you may have noticed about what I did a couple minutes ago there. I was sort of creating these column shapes around that focal area at the base of that big structure, and I think I made like 3 of them that were all sort of equal size and of equal illumination. They were all very bright. They're all very even, and I immediately picked up on the fact that it was not working. Having those 3 very similar shapes in that area in a sort of non-deliberate way was creating a lot of confusion and a bit of noise. So I ended up getting rid of a couple of them, and I made one very small, and they're not even very well-defined shapes at this point. It's just sort of a rough trapezoid or triangle of light, but I'm still thinking about how those shapes are relating to each other and how they might interfere with one another and how it might disrupt the viewer's path through that area. So another fun thing I've done here just now is taken one of those foliage brushes, and I think what I did is I put it on linear dodge with a deep red color, and what that does is it sort of creates the impression that there's light hitting some more like red senescent foliage. I think that's I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I think I felt strongly at that point that this piece needed a bit of red to balance out the color scheme, and so I put some of that in, and what I'm doing here is also this brush is actually, I think it's called a grass detail brush. It's really useful for creating grass, but it's also useful within a selection like this for creating streaks across things, which can be useful for creating texture, but also for creating shadows along a distant flat plane, because when there are multiple shadows crossing a distant plane, they're going to be all squished together. You're not going to be able to see each individual one for each object. So by making that selection and then just doing some quick streaks across it, you can quickly, just as I did at the top of that rock structure, you can quickly create the impression that that there are shadows, a lot of individual shadows being cast in sort of a dappled light effect. So at this point, I'm just trying to develop that focal area a bit more. I'm trying to create some more contrast there by having an overlapping shadowed shape against those brightly illuminated areas at the base of the cliff path. And I think I'm also experimenting here with adding a bit more saturated colors, especially greens in there. I really want to create the impression that there's a lot of lush foliage and moss and sort of undergrowth here, and that this is sort of a magical place that's really filled with life. And then another thing I'm doing here is I've actually I've taken that green and I've moved it towards the gray and painted in on the face of the rock that is facing that dappled light. So the resulting effect being that it looks like some of that light is being reflected up at the rock, and it almost looks red in the context. But when you look at the actual color that's being used, it's still just a dull green. But against the warm light source, it does, and against the cool shadows around it, it does look sort of like a dull red. And that's, I think that was one of the most useful color harmony principles that I ended up picking up. And I think I must have learned it from Marco Bucci in one of his videos, because he has a lot of really fantastic videos on color and color harmony. If you haven't checked out his channel already, I strongly recommend it. I've learned so much from it, and he's a really great teacher, and he presents things in a really really fun way. Using grays not only as a transition between different colors, different local colors, but also as a transition between warm and cool tones, and a means of creating warm or cool tones within the context of a single warm or cool area. And for example, if you are creating an area of dappled light where there's a lot of warm yellow-orange light hitting that area, and you want to create some shadows among that area, your first instinct might be to go straight to blue, and that might be useful in a case where you want to create a lot of high contrast, or it's a big open space where there's a lot of sky color filtering through. But in most cases, you can just achieve that effect by sliding your saturation towards the gray, and against those warmer tones, that gray will look very much like a cool shadow, even though it's still in the yellow-orange family. Likewise, if you have a shadow, as I did in the case of that little rock there around the focal point, where you want to show some reflected light, or you want to create some variation in warmth around that area, you can push your cool blue shadow towards the gray to make it appear warmer. So I'm again sort of experimenting with creating some dappled light in this midground, and I remember being a little bit on the fence about this because it's a lot of contrast, sort of adjacent to the main focal point, and I don't want it to steal attention away from it, and I want it to support the progression from the foreground of this piece to that focal point. So that's why I sort of went in with the smudge tool and sort of blurred out that area a little bit, and reducing the edge firmness around there does help to make it more of a supporting detail. It creates a little bit less contrast around there. So this is pretty key right here. I'm using a color balance on the overall piece, and that can really help to reinforce a existing color contrast that you've established with your piece. And it can also just help you take it into a different mood if you want to be more extreme with it, but I find I mostly just use it to sort of reinforce patterns that I've already developed. If you do use it too much, you can risk reducing your overall color diversity, which is really important, your color variety. So you don't want to overdo it with the color balance, unless you are going for sort of a simplistic either monochromatic or analogous color scheme or something like that. But I do tend to try to keep a lot of color variety in my pieces. I think it's very important for creating interest and for sort of capturing the eye and creating realism as well. I mean, I feel like it's sort of a bit strange to imagine like high color variation as being a very realistic thing, and some people will say that more monochromatic schemes tend to be more realistic, but what I've found is that the world is filled with color variety, and even something as simple as a field of grass, to most of us would appear green, but if you actually try to paint a field of grass with just green and like a shadow green, it's not going to be very convincing, because in reality, within that field of grass there are variations in the local color of those blades. There are variations in the life cycle of those grasses. Some of them might be dying out, which gives them more of a yellow or a red. Some of them might be reflecting more sky color, which gives them a bit more blue. Some of them might be, sort of facing the light in such a way that they become very muted or gray. And so, and I find that pretty much applies to anything that, even a solid red ball, is always relating to its environment in some way and will have a lot of color variety present. So, that's part of the reason why I try to establish a lot of that at the beginning of the piece, because it's sometimes a little bit easier to create that as a baseline than it is to try to sort of inject it later on. And this is another great evident brush, the branch brush, which I gotta say I don't use it too often, but it has some really nice applications, and that just saved me a whole bunch of time. And I think I just put it down 3 times, but that was enough to create the impression of some little trees growing there. And I've also oriented them in such a way that they are sort of in line with the rough 2-point perspective that I've set up, or 3-point perspective that I've set up here, and B, they're also serving as composition blockers or guides. So the tree is not leading the eye off the edge of the page. It's helping to keep everything focused inward towards this focal area. And I'm also experimenting with more of these nice foliage brushes here, and I'm starting to incorporate more of that red there just because I felt like it was needed in the piece. And also these all these tree branch sapling things, they do need leaves, otherwise they're going to look quite barren. And that's not the vibe I'm trying to go with this piece. Yeah, so I'm going in with a lot of these more specific sort of textural brushes, just trying to create the general impression that there's some complex foliage happening around, but I do want to be careful that it doesn't create too much complexity near the edge of the canvas or around places that I don't want the eye to be drawn. So if I do end up going overboard with it, there are a number of solutions I can use to sort of dial it back. I can smudge out those areas, I can blur them out, I can use a large soft brush to sort of fade them out or reduce contrast in those areas. You know, if you've created too much noise and detail in non focal areas of your piece, it's usually relatively simple to fix that. The key, though, being is that you have to be willing to make that happen. And I remember having a lot of difficulty with that. Starting out as an artist was like I would spend all this time creating this really detailed spot, you know, or like a whole bunch of really detailed spots around the canvas, and I wanted to make everything really highly rendered and developed throughout the piece. And then I would like step back and look at it, and it would just be this pile of noise. Essentially, it just wouldn't read well from a distance. And so, you know, what I had to learn is essentially nothing here is sacred. Just because you've put time into it, or just because you've invested a lot of thought and energy into it, doesn't mean it's going to be the right thing at the end. And you have to be sort of willing to recognize those things when they come up, and to be willing to just paint over them if it doesn't work. So these are kind of some of the getting towards the final touches with this piece, and I'm sort of bouncing back and forth between creating these details and then using a larger soft brush to sort of lose them and to create some atmosphere. You saw I just did that with that large blue sort of foggy effect in the background there, as well as I used the brush on linear dodge mode with an intense red around that focal point, and that creates this nice light bloom effect. So at this point in the piece, I'm really just sort of creating some some fine details and creating more clarity around that focal area, and of all the points in the painting that I want to develop and make clear, that's going to be the most important. I find that with any piece, if you can make a certain area, your focal area, if you can make that convincing and realistic, it doesn't really matter that much what you do in the rest of the piece. It's all just supporting an implied detail, and you want to get it to a point where it sort of looks relatively finished. But I mean, I find even in a lot of great artists that I follow on ArtStation or on Instagram, they can have these beautifully, like, highly detailed rendered things. I'm like, how does that look so realistic? And when you look closer, you realize that it's really just that detail and that realism is really just restricted to 10 to 20, sometimes 40, 50, 70% of the piece. But if you look at the edges, you can still see the underpainting. You can still see those rough strokes around the border where they really haven't even developed it from the very first strokes that they put down. And they've done that deliberately because developing those areas is A, unnecessary, and B, would sort of detract from the most important elements of the painting. So in this case, it's really not super necessary that I spend too much time detailing these rocks in the foreground, even though they do take up about a third to half of the whole piece. Because ultimately, what I want them to be is peripheral objects. I want them to look realistic if you are looking at the main focal point. And that's deliberate because you want your painting to mimic what the human eye does, how the human eye actually processes information, or how a camera will process information. You're creating this sort of artificial depth of field effect where you're not seeing everything at once, and that it makes the whole piece a lot easier for your viewer to process quickly. And that's not to say that you can't develop highly realistic, intricate detail throughout the whole piece. You can absolutely do that, but when you do, you have to be even more careful that those details aren't competing against one another. There's not nearly as much contrast in all those little leaves that you're meticulously painting out, or that you've applied through a photo texture in the foreground, as there is in contrast in those same objects around your focal area. Nor do you want them to be quite as saturated or highly distinct. And that's also not to say that you have to spend any less time on the other areas of your painting. Just because they are loose and unfocused doesn't mean they don't require as much deliberation or thought or time or effort. You can see here with this piece, I think what I did end up doing here in the last 15 minutes or so of this piece is I think I spent just a bit too much time developing this area, and perhaps not enough time creating clarity around the focal point. What I am trying to do though is creating a bit of color variety, but also some nice texture, just some quick implied texture, and also some nice cool tones that will reflect the sky and just the general shadowed nature of this part of the painting. And not only am I incorporating cool tones here, but I'm also, you can see along the right face of those sort of mossy, rocky structures in the close midground, there is reflected light as well, because that rock on the right is being directly illuminated, and there's some nice particles that I added there as well, which can help to create that atmosphere. But that light is also going to be reflected back onto the rocks along the left side. So I've included some warmer reds and yellows and greens there to help reinforce that. And I might have pushed it a little too far, but you know, a lot of times it's just sort of I'm just sort of making a note about it. You know, I'll put down that stroke as a reminder to myself, like, hey, there's some reflected light here. I'm working on other stuff right now, but I'm gonna get back to that and develop it a bit further. Maybe mute it down a little bit. Maybe add a bit of shading and detail and around that area. And that's sort of the next step that I'm going into here, is again using that selection tool to create some nice hard shadows. So you can use the selection tool for that. That's really nice for getting those really those nice cut off shadows. But also, what I end up doing here as well is going in with and doing a bit of drawing too, and that can be really nice, just to create a bit more detail and clarity around your sort of loose painterly shapes. And then another thing I noticed here was that this illuminated spot was just sort of a bit too washed out and didn't have a lot of definition or variety or contrast around it. So I'm going in again with the selection tool and creating some areas where the light is not hitting there. I'm creating some variation in the rock face, and that's just going to create a bit more interest and realism around that area, because right now it's pretty it's not particularly well defined, and I think I'm just picking up on that now, and just sort of trying to make this a bit less abstract, a bit more deliberate and representational. But then I'm also going back to this midground and just sort of bouncing around a lot. At this point, I'm just sort of seeing things that pop up that need to happen. I think what I needed to do there was create a nice, clean, hard edge at the edge of that shape to create the impression of overlapping. And I'm doing a bit of the same thing here. I want there to be a nice, clean, hard edge where the edge of a plane is created in the three-dimensional space. And creating overlap and deliberately overlapping a lot of shapes is in itself, regardless of the edges you use, it's a really great way to establish three-dimensionality in your piece. And here I'm just experimenting with some nice cool blues. I think that balances out the whole color scheme, and It really makes the shadows pop out nicely and gives them some color and interest. So I'm at the point in this piece where I want to just be making some overall touch-ups, some adjustments to the lighting and the overall color and value balance. So again, I'm using that linear dodge brush with a deep red color. It's such a useful tool because it will brighten up an area, but it will also create that the colored edge of a light source, where it kind of refracts around other objects and creates a bit more darker, saturated color, which really is really helpful for creating realistic light. You don't want your light to just be totally colorless. It'll tend to be whiter and yellow towards the center if it's a warm light source, and then a bit redder and orange around the edges and where it sort of wraps around objects. Yeah, so I think at this point I'm just going to be sort of going through some of these final details, so I'm just going to sort of be quiet for a little bit and let you listen to the music and watch me wrap this piece up, and then I'll just pop back in and touch base at the end here. Okay, so that concludes this hour-ish speed painting tutorial. I hope you found it helpful or informative, or at the very least entertaining. And if you would like to see more content like this, please go ahead and hit like and subscribe. And please feel free to drop a comment and let me know if you would like to see more content like this, or if there's anything else you would like to see, either in my live streams or any of my time-lapse videos, or if you would just like to see more narrated walkthroughs like this. So I hope you all are doing well out there, and until next time, take care.